All right. So everybody, thanks so much for listening to our program, Fire Breathing Rob. We have a returning guest, Daniel Levin, on. Last time he was on, we spoke about his book. All right. And I hope people have actually gone out and buy it. I know a couple of people have told me that they really love the interview that we last did. It was a proof of life. Definitely check it out on Amazon or wherever bookstores are. I mean, wherever books are sold, bookstores. Well, so yeah, definitely check it out in bookstores again, Amazon, whatever bookstore you go to. A Proof of Life. It's by Daniel Levin, and I'm looking forward to another talk about the Middle East and many issues involved with the Middle East. So, Daniel, thanks so much for coming back on. I love this.
My pleasure, Rob. It's great talking to you.
All right. So let's talk about this. So just going into recent issues on the Middle East, since you've been there, you've lived there. As far as that goes, I want to talk about the Iron Dome. I know you were in the Israeli military, so this issue may be huge with you. I'm sure it is. Now, we just saw a lot of Democrats that voted against the Iron Dome, but and the way I'm hearing it is now that they put it in another bill and that's passed. So, first of all, before we even kick that around, what is your opinion on that as a person that's lived in Israel, as a person that's been in the military in general, how important it is?
So there are a lot of ways to unpack that. Let's just remember what we're talking about. The Iron Dome is a missile defense system that can intercept at a pretty high success rate, 90% or above incoming missiles. Every missile that is shot to intercept it, meaning of the Iron Dome system, costs about $40,000. So let's just keep that in mind. So now in exchanges with Gaza, you can have hundreds, actually thousands of missiles raining onto Israel. So just imagine for a moment what that costs, just intercepting that. And that's just a little teaser compared to the amount of missiles, Iranian-made missiles, that are in the Hezbollah's arsenal in southern Lebanon. We're talking hundreds of thousands of missiles. So suddenly, the cost of Iron Dome, of doing it effectively at that kind of a missile war, becomes something almost unsustainable. That's just a little bit of background. It's probably the most effective missile-to-missile defense system that exists in the world today. It's a far cry from the Patriot missiles that were deployed in the Gulf War in 1990, 1991. I was in the Israeli army at the time. I can tell you that was a PR exercise. The Patriot missiles weren't effective at all at intercepting Scud B missiles that Saddam Hussein had at the time. And those were primitive missiles compared to more advanced Scuds like Scud C or any other missiles. So the Patriot solution was not a solution. Patriots hadn't been developed actually from missile to missile, but rather as anti-tank missiles. So it wasn't really intended. Iron Dome is a very effective system. Now, just briefly, the Democrats that objected to it, irrespective of where we stand politically, Democrat, Republican, objected to it, not so much in the funding of the Iron Dome, but the fact that the Democratic leadership, Nancy Pelosi, sort of raised it in the last moment in order to cram it through Congress without any possibility of hearing. That's number one. Number two, and in fact, the most so-called progressive wing of the Democrats weren't necessarily the ones objecting to it the loudest. So it was really more of a procedural issue. The other issue is Iron Dome is actually something that even those who are very critical of Israel tend to be in favor for, because the thinking really is that it also protects the Palestinian population in many ways. First of all, from being hit by missiles, because the populations are really narrowly intertwined in the region. And second of all, because the alternative, let's say Gaza fires hundreds of thousands of missiles into Israel, as they just did, without an Iron Dome system, you have mass casualty in Israel. And there's no doubt that leads to a physical ground-to-ground incursion into Gaza, and then you're in full-scale war. So there's something about Iron Domes. Again, forget how people feel politically, right, left, pro, against Israel, Palestine. It doesn't matter for now. Just in terms of bottom line, is it's actually a good thing because it really prevents an escalation. So that's number one. Number two, I just want to mention this briefly. When we talk about military aid to Israel, I think people get it a little bit twisted here. The primary beneficiaries of military aid to Israel are American weapons manufacturers. In other words, this is military aid to Israel to buy American weapon systems. So this actually is money that goes to American manufacturers and American jobs. Again, this is not a political statement. It's not about whether you like Israel or don't like Israel. So just let's not get that part twisted. It's not like hundreds of millions or billions are just sent to Israel in a bank-to-bank transaction in suitcases of cash. This is payments that goes to the manufacturers and distributors of these weapon systems in the United States. So just a little parenthesis of that. But I think that most people, however you feel about Ben and Jerry's boycott of in the territory, however you feel about Israel, I think most reasonable people will agree that having defensive missile shields will help, either because you're pro-Israel and you want to strengthen Israel, or because you really are empathetic with the Palestinian plight. In that case, it's still preventing an escalation that would cause massively higher casualties on all sides of the war. So that's just putting the whole thing a little bit in the context here.
I appreciate you doing that, because a lot of people don't look at both sides like you just explained. They just listen to the propaganda on the media. And that was so well explained. I wish you were on the news to tell a lot of these numbskulls that listen to this propaganda, and you explained it extremely well. What would you say, and you kind of explained it in the last answer, we have these people, going back to the president, and I'm not trying to really inflict politics on this, but the America First crowd that says, and I remember Donald Trump coming into office saying we're going to cut back on, giving money to this country, to that country, regardless of what country it was. What would you say to that crowd that's saying, again, why are we giving money to all these other countries to build up their defense system? And what would you say to them? My argument back is that obviously Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. We have to take care of them. If Israel is obliterated, then we're really screwed in the Middle East in general. Plus, it would be a genocide, like you said.
I think, if you take any kind of ideology out of this discussion, then first of all, the whole America First is a bit of an odd, it's just a slogan, right? And usually when you have bumper stickers, it's not a good way, right or left, it's not a good way to have policy. The Iron Dome is a good example where this is really not being money that's being thrown around to other regimes. There are examples of that. There are examples of money. And I think that normally, whenever you're talking about this issue, you have to follow the money and the pork involved. The same is true as why our rail systems crash, or why our schools look the way they look, or why we can't build water pipelines from the east where there's too much water to the west where there's not enough water. It's not because it can't be done. It's because there's so much graft involved in the people who enrich themselves that it kills these projects. And so weapons, why do you think the US military budget every year increases by a number that's bigger than the Russian entire military budget, right? These are projects, in many cases, projects that the military itself says, we don't need those weapon systems. We don't need. By the time we implement them, they'll be obsolete, like F-35 fighter jets, for example, right? Why does that happen? It's because along the way, so many companies and individuals enrich themselves. So whether you talk about America First, about foreign involvement, or money spent here, you always have to look at the money trail and see who benefits. Now, when it comes to America First, on a more if you take it more in a historical context, you have to look back at the last century. Look at the 20th century, at the First World War, then you have the Second World War. America emerges from the Second World War as kind of the dominant global superpower juxtaposed with the Soviet Union. And it's a binary world which collapses on the East, in the Eastern Europe, in the late 80s, early 90s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, right? And new countries emerging, things that we're feeling still today. Now, we can't just say, for example, that our increasing escalation with China today is just the new Cold War, just like it was with the Soviet Union. And so we should look at American interests and just pull back. Why should we fund military bases everywhere? Why? 50 years ago, 40 years ago, even at the end of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union were not intertwined like this. You could separate those worlds. In fact, those worlds were separated. Very few people from the West traveled to Eastern Europe, and very few Russians or Soviets traveled into the West, right? Now, today, that's a different world. US-China is not like that. We're in a globalized economy. If you have an iPhone that's manufactured in China, it's done with rare earths that China controls. That's a US market, US company. The worlds are completely intertwined. So when we start screaming America First, or let's not spend abroad, it's never that sentence. Again, that's a bumper sticker. What comes after that? What's the sentence after that? What's the next slogan? Is it, well, we shouldn't spend abroad, but we should spend on our own schools, or we should spend our own healthcare? Or is it, we shouldn't spend abroad and give ourselves some nice little tax cut again, right? What's the thinking here? It's not just because unless we believe that the US has no more role to play on the international stage, that we should conduct ourselves like Switzerland or Belgium or Kenya, right? And no disrespect to any of these countries. I am also part Swiss, so this is not intended disrespectfully, but unless you're saying the US, like any other country, should only narrowly care about its own interests, then this America First slogan is nonsense. And I'll give you an example. If you have a war breaking out in the Middle East, in the past we used to talk about the Persian Gulf or the Suez Canal, the energy security that we need by securing the free transport of oil originating in Saudi Arabia, for example, right? Which was the entire basis of our position, US's position in the Middle East. Now, what's at stake? Just think this through because it's a little more complicated. Let's say we say, you know what? The Middle East, they're all crazy. They're all going to fight. Let's get out of Saudi Arabia. Let's not worry about Iran. Let's not worry about Israel. What do we need to be there? So let's remember just one little thing. The US dollar is today the dominant global reserve currency. It's not the Chinese currency because it's not freely tradable. It's not the pound, which took a beating. Swiss bank's too small, right? The euro obviously is not a global. It's the US is a global reserve currency. Why is it that? One of the main reasons is because we had a deal with Saudi Arabia that they would price every oil transaction. They and OPEC would price every oil transaction in US dollars in return for US troops and security in the region. You collapse that, you have repercussions that are economic repercussions beyond just whether we have soldier stations. So when I hear stuff like America First, I don't even know what people are talking about. You know, what does it mean, America First? You want to reduce a military base somewhere? You want to stop giving money to Pakistan? You can talk about each case individually, but only intelligently talk about it if you understand the consequences of that statement. Otherwise, it's really nothing but a bumper sticker.
But didn't America First go away with trade deals in general when they started?
Yeah, I mean, trade is one way that we're intertwined, but we even mess up that. So, for example, we have trade with China. It's a very important part of our policy, and there are legitimate concerns, which, for example, which change over time. So let's say 10 years ago, China undervalued its currency in order to help its exports. It basically, by undervaluing its currency, made its products cheaper, right?
Yeah.
The US said, no, that doesn't work. And in fact, progressive Democrats, mainly from the Midwest, from the Rust Belt, said, we can't export auto parts there. We can't compete with you on whatever, cars, for example, if your products are so much cheaper than ours, right? Or dishwashers, it could be anything, right? Steel. And so there was a discussion with that, and the Chinese finally adjusted their currency. So the currency is fairly priced today. Those who are still screaming China's a currency manipulator don't have their facts straight. So when you get to trade, you have legitimate concerns. What are legitimate concerns? Are legitimate concerns. Is the other country a currency manipulator? Are they disadvantaging? Are they slapping tariffs on our products so that they're unaffordable in their country? And then should we do the same by retaliating there, right? That's different from saying, I'm just going to, I just don't like that country, or by throwing, let's say, human rights issues into trade. That's complicated, right? There's a difference between saying my American worker and the Chinese worker or the Vietnamese worker or some other worker are not competing fairly because of what you're doing with currency policy or tariffs. That's different from saying, I don't want to trade with you because of the way you treat your dissidents. Now, that's where ideology kicks in. And I'm not expressing an opinion. I'm just saying that's what we have to be clean about our thinking, which is, hey, if we want to mix in human rights issues, for example, with trade, we can do that. But two things will happen. First of all, we're not going to have a lot of resolution to trade disputes, right? Because people just don't want to be told that. And the second thing that happened, and Americans just have to understand this. If you're going to do that, let's say you go to China and say, hey, we don't like how you treat your Uyghurs. Chinese look at you and say, well, we don't like what you did to Native Americans. We don't like, a few hundred years of slavery. We don't like George Floyd when your, white policeman puts his knee on a black man's neck and kills him, right, over 9 minutes. And so you have to be a little bit careful when you start screaming that stuff and you're holier than thou and you're pointing out every human rights violation, you're throwing rocks in a glass house. And so I just want my fellow Americans to understand that it's not that I'm saying you shouldn't, for example, insist on good labor standards, not only from a human perspective, but also from a competitive perspective. In other words, if I have slave labor in a country, yeah, my American exporters can't compete with that. So it's not only is it a human issue, it's also a commercial issue.
I just want to go into this because you talked about Saudi Arabia and the embargo and stuff. I think that's extremely important because to me, and I want to get your opinion on this, it seems like America is real. I mean, I think they're personally sold out to China as far as the government. And you can push back on this whenever you like. I also think that we're sold out to Saudi Arabia. We go back to the embargo. We go back to the 9/11 attacks. 15 out of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. The madrasas in Saudi Arabia chanting death to America, teaching hatred toward Israel, and we are supporting them, and they just keep doing this year after year, and they're creating terrorists through their madrasas. So what is your opinion on that, that we just keep, pumping them up in plain English?
I think that if you, there's a difference. It's kind of the example that I would answer first is if, God forbid, someone did harm to my child, and you asked me, what should you do to that person? If you're asking me as a father, I'd say, I'll take a gun and shoot that person or
Right.
torture him first, right? But if you're asking me as a president or as a judge, I have a rule of law and I have to be smart about my answer and I have to be just about my answer. And I would apply the same to the answer to your question, which is, it's real easy to say, the hell with China, they're dominating us, or, we're giving in to them, or Saudi Arabians, they were all terrorists. That's an emotional answer, and I understand it, but it's not the way to do foreign policy. I understand it, and I would never say that to a family of a victim of 9/11. I understand when you emotionally have a stake in it, that's hard. But as a country, we have an obligation to be smart. We have an obligation to understand, and you can have alliances. So, for example, the one approach with Saudi Arabia is to say, hey, in fact, 15 of 19 were Saudis. Hey, and you know what? The current king in Saudi Arabia, King Salman, at the time was governor of Riyadh, and it was his Islamist charities that were supporting terror cells all over the world. That was, in fact, his role. It wasn't Crown Prince Abdullah at the time. It was him. Now, what I would do is the smart answer to that is to flip it and say, look, you owe us. Because you either get with us, and here is what we need in terms of geopolitics, alliances, whether it's in relation to China, whether it's in relation to Iran, whether it's in relation to Israel. Here's how we can move ahead and leave the past and 9/11 and move on. If not, then we're going to treat you the way we believe you deserve to be treated based on 9/11. I'm oversimplifying that, but the smart foreign policy is taking our interest into account there.
Do you think that's why Obama vetoed that bill? Remember, they had that bill from the 9/11 about suing Saudi Arabia, passed the House, passed the Senate, and Obama vetoed it. This is back in 2015.
Every American president until now has vetoed disclosing not just Saudi 9/11 implications, but Trump did the same thing when people were pushing to disclose, and then the Republican leadership at Trump's request stopped it too. There's so much dirty stuff untold. And I mean dirty stuff is dirty money, dirty relationships, American companies that have enriched themselves there, Saudi investments into Hollywood. So many people have a vested interest in not talking publicly about these things, right? So many people have been unregistered lobbyists. And I don't just mean for the Saudis. This is not just about the Saudis. Enough people have a powerful interest in preventing that kind of disclosure. If all these things were made public, heads would not stop rolling. We would not stop rolling. And just quickly to close the loop, I think that when it comes to China, I think we really have lost the ability to discuss this intelligently. China is not some tiny little grocery store down the road. China is a country that had Confucius 2,500 years ago, who was talking about religious principles. Don't do to the others that you don't want done to yourself. Hundreds and hundreds of years before the beginning of recorded Judaism in the Bronze Age and Christianity. So we need to put a little bit of respect on that. That doesn't make me a panda hugger. That's not the point. This is an ancient culture, dynasties that have been hugely influential, that have developed things and invented things that pasta was developed in China, not in Italy, actually. And We're talking about thousands of years of an evolved society that happened to have an awful 20th century with mass poverty. Friends of mine my age who were born in the 60s, who, when I go to China with them, who don't stop eating at a buffet because they remind me that when they were kids, they were starving and they would eat paper and cardboard to survive. So China now is saying, hey, we're 1.5 billion people. We're a superpower. Put some respect on our name. This is not the Soviet Union that imploded economically. Put some respect. Now, it's not to defend China and China's actions, but unless we start to look at it as equals and don't go into China and start telling them, oh, you guys, what do you know? You're all just baby killers and you're all human rights violators. That's not the way to develop that relationship. Now, we have interests and we have allies also in the Pacific, and we have to take it seriously. And when you need to confront a foreign party, you need to confront it. But just the general polemic about being soft on China, that's just silly talk for me. That doesn't take our actual interests into account.
How do you think Biden will do with the relationship with China? And as vice president, he was basically an envoy to the Obama administration to meet with Xi. So what is your opinion on that?
Xi today is not the Xi that Biden met with. So there's something extremely important that happened. China had an understanding. Deng Xiaoping was the Chinese paramount leader, right, who sort of came after this horrible period of Mao Zedong with mass famine. Deng Xiaoping was one of the great leaders of the 20th century, maybe up there with Winston Churchill, maybe a few others, maybe FDR, but Deng Xiaoping was one of the giants, and I mean real giants, even though he was a really short man, okay? What Deng Xiaoping figured out is that he had 1 billion and some people that he needed to feed, and he needed to figure out how to do that. He wasn't vain, he didn't care about titles, and he instituted something that was extremely important. He said, we're going to have term limits. Whoever becomes the paramount leader in China, right? 2 terms. And it's a trinity. You're the president, you're the chairman of the Communist Party, and the chairman of the Central Military Commission, meaning chief of staff, essentially, right? Head of the army. That's the trinity in China. Deng wasn't interested, but those who came after him, and people like Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, they said term limits, 2 terms, and you're out. So they didn't want to have another Mao kind of situation. Then comes Xi Jinping, who won an internal battle against others like Bo Xilai, the governor of Chongqing, the mayor of Chongqing, one of the cities, one of the other princelings. These were all princelings in the sense that they were sons of leaders of the communist revolution. Okay, Xi's father was, Bo Xilai's father was, others were, right? And he had a meteoric rise, very smart, very disciplined, understands the US, actually lived with a family in Ohio when he was a young man. Okay, very smart. Very, very smart man. I can tell you from firsthand knowledge. Bid his time, understood when he came to power, he had a power base in Shanghai that got into power. First thing he did, he got rid of all the generals in the army who owed their allegiance to his predecessors. Not actually to Hu Jintao right before him, but to Jiang Zemin before that. Okay, so now he installed people that were loyal to him. He was very disciplined, finished the first term, and then said, you know what, we're going to undo term limits. And so the one that Biden met, the man that he met, the guy who came to power 2013, 2014, that was a guy who played by the same rules. Okay, we're going to cooperate. We're not going to. Then something switched. He undid term limits and he became a Chinese nationalist, meaning he does China first. Exactly what you said, America first. It's China first from the Chinese side. And they're going to say no more scared of military escalation, no more scared that if someone says something bad about us and we don't hit back. Because Deng Xiaoping always said, let everyone underestimate you, no problem. Let them think you're a fool, let them think you're poor. Let's grow and grow and grow. And he was very disciplined about that. Xi Jinping said, no, we're done with that. We're done being humiliated, we're done. We had the opium wars, we had the denigration of the 20th century. Now, there's a real parallel here, if you allow me, just one more sentence on that.
Yeah, no, please.
At the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union collapses. Right. At some point, Putin comes to power in early 2000s. At the time, the US, under Bill Clinton, in a policy that actually was formed by Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State at the time, expanded NATO to include the former Warsaw Pact Eastern European countries. NATO was essentially expanding eastwards. And Russia was saying, hey, we're Russia. Again, we're not some little, we're not Albania, we're not some Caribbean island, we're Russia. We're a nuclear power. Put some respect on our name, even if we collapse economically. Do not forget who we are. We're a giant nuclear power. And so stop expanding NATO eastwards. And I can tell you there was a meeting with Bill Clinton, Sandy Berger, National Security Advisor, Madeleine Albright, and Vladimir Putin. I know that firsthand. And Putin says to them, you've got to stop expanding NATO eastwards, because if you're going to do that, at some point, we're going to head into confrontation. And everyone said, no, we got to do that. So Putin said, look, we have two options. You either expand it eastwards and we head to confrontation, or I give you an offer. How about you admit Russia into NATO? And Bill Clinton looked at the drapes, Sandy Berger looked at his shoes, Madeleine Albright shook her head. No one took it. Imagine how different the world is if Russia is part of NATO right now. So those are historical. So it was the same mistake. No, we won the Cold War. We're going to do a victory dance, which is what George Bush Sr. at the time was saying, right? And so that was a missed opportunity. And we're running the risk of making the same mistake with China, which is we're choosing victory dances and silly confrontations and not really understanding what Russia is, what China is.
I was told that the mistake with China that we made was letting them in the WTO back in '99.
Not really, because they dominated global trade. So you can say, okay, I don't want you in the WTO. So it's kind of like go into the corner and wait until I call you, or a bad boy. That's the kind of don't let him in, right? Well, don't forget, you know what? For everything that you need today in electronics, you need something called rare earths. You know who controls about 98% of the rare earth market? China. All right. No rare earths, no lights at JFK Airport, right? No rare earths, no GPS signals, no rare earths, no irrigation and traffic lights. So at some point, it's super easy when you run for office and you're a senator from some state or or a House member, or whoever, you run for office and say, oh, those Chinese, they're eating our lunch. I'm going to show them who a tough guy is. You're doing the whole John Wayne kind of thing. That's easy to do. But if you're responsible, you don't do that. I'm not saying you have to bend down. I'm not saying you have to be sort of give in on points, but you have to be smart about these things. And you have to recognize that in the year 2021, our interests and China's interests are intertwined. And we have two amazing examples. One's the pandemic. So you want to scream at them and say, originated there, came out of a lab. You can do that. That's fine. But you're not solving it without China. They have the data on the origins of that pandemic, right? So you either cooperate with them. So you either say, no, you guys, you've been bad boys. We're going to kick you out of the World Health Organization. You haven't cooperated with us. And they say, no problem. Good luck in the next pandemic. Other example is climate change. Now, I don't have to like Chinese behavior, but to say that there's a solution to climate change without the US and China running that show is absurd. It's just absurd. The biggest polluters in the world. China is still extremely reliant on coal. Now there are success stories. I'll give you a success story. There's technology now available, agriculture technology that it's essentially reversing what happened in the agriculture in a pre-Dust Bowl. What happened was that we started to till the earth. And when we started to till the earth, it produced more, but it decreased the quality of the earth. It led to the Dust Bowl. What it led to is sucking less CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is a big part of global warming. Mm-hmm. China and the US are cooperating on projects that are basically no-till agriculture, right? It's a sustainable agriculture models that have changed deserts into green lands, okay? These are hyper-successful cooperations that exist between China and the US at a governmental level. You know why no one talks about them? Because they're scared of being told they're soft on China. You understand? That's a silly way to look at the world. Look, there are interests, and when China works against our interests, absolutely call it out. I can tell you from firsthand experience of the last few days, myself involved, that the Chinese are helping with an American currently behind the scenes. No one knows about it, just out of a personal relationship. Okay, so it's real easy to run to a microphone and fire off a tweet about China eating our lunch, all that. It's real easy to do that, and it feels good for a moment. I get you a few votes wherever you are. But when the dust settles, it's not responsible. What's responsible is to understand what is our interest. And there are times you've got to say, no, that doesn't work for us, or even sometimes have a military confrontation. When it's unavoidable, it's unavoidable. But just to spout these slogans without really thinking what's affected, it's real easy, it's real cheap, it gets you a lot of applause. but it doesn't really help the Americans, not the American worker, not American citizens, whether it's in the US or worldwide.
Oh, I'm going to get off China, but my last comment is, I know you said Xi is a lot different than when Biden met him for the first time back 2013, 2014. You know, Biden is 78 years old. Harris really doesn't have much foreign policy experience either. Are you worried about that group in there to deal with China and all these other foreign policy issues, but specifically China, since we're just speaking about that right now?
Who was the last president who had foreign policy experience?
That's a good point.
Nixon, who was the last one together with Kissinger, who had intelligent China policy. I mean, who? George Bush Sr., you could argue.
Bush
He had
Sr.
positions
with
as an
the
ambassador
military.
and CIA head, but who? Reagan didn't know. Reagan couldn't find China on the map. Right? Clinton didn't have foreign policy experience. I'm not saying he wasn't
No.
smart, but didn't have any experience. He was governor of Arkansas.
Yeah.
Right? Bush Jr. had zero foreign policy experience. He was running the Texas Rangers did the Sammy Sosa trade. That was his foreign policy experience, right?
Yeah.
And so who? Obama didn't have foreign policy experience. I mean, he lived abroad and he lived in Indonesia as a young man, but his father was Kenyan, but he didn't have foreign policy experience. Nothing particularly. He was a legislator in Illinois and then had half a term in the Senate.
So you
Obviously,
think
Trump,
that Biden's got more foreign policy chops than all these guys?
he
then?
has chops, but I don't need my president to understand every single aspect of foreign policy. I need my president to have a temperament to be informed.
Mhm.
That's what I need, right? Whether it's a woman or a man, I need the person. There's no way. Listen, I need a president to understand nuclear policy.
Mhm.
You know, if I'm president, I'm not a nuclear scientist. We haven't had a nuclear scientist as president, right? But you need to know that you have the right people there and that you have to listen to the experts. It's no different in foreign policy than it is on corona response, on pandemic response.
Mhm.
You have to be willing to listen to the experts, right? And so that's what I need. So for me, I'm looking for a president with the right temperament and intelligence, a degree of modesty where they're open to learning, but a certain charisma and presence where they're still confident. That's the balance you want to strike. A person who is a sponge for information, but also resolute and can make decisions. The knock on Obama is that he kept on informing himself and wouldn't make decisions. Again, it's not a political preference of mine. The knock on Bush was he wasn't interested in information. He was happy to make decisions, but didn't need the information. That's why Dick Cheney made him for him, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a political statement. The temperament I'm looking for is someone who wants to be informed and then can, with the right information, make a confident decision.
So, well, let's go right into Afghanistan because that's a great segue right into that. So, Daniel, my thing is we had to get out of Afghanistan. You spoke about this in the last interview that obviously it was going to be tough to get out regardless, but it was just like ripping off uh it was like ripping off a bad band-aid. It had to go off. So I think the Biden administration personally did a good job. I mean, there was some, the 13 soldiers died, God rest their souls. That's what happened with them. But regardless with that, they still got over like 200,000 people out of Afghanistan and still working to get some stragglers that were left behind. But besides that, what is your opinion? Do you agree? Do you think that the Biden administration did a pretty good job leaving Afghanistan?
I think it was necessary to leave it quickly. I'm not someone to now start throwing, shade at the Biden administration. I think that the one really awful mistake, and every life loss is tragic. So my hearts go out to all those families, and I really mean that. It's not just empty words, not the usual sort of thoughts and prayer nonsense after school shootings and then nothing changes. But the real mistake beyond the lives loss is that a plan wasn't implemented to move out sensitive military equipment in time. In other words, they just assumed erroneously with bad intelligence that they had months and months to move out that equipment, which they didn't have. And that was a gamble they shouldn't have taken. In other words, let's say you have intelligence that says, hey, you got 9 months before Kabul might be overrun. Well, maybe that's wrong. And if it's wrong, I shouldn't risk it. So I get rid of all that equipment because that's not only in the Taliban's hand, that's actually in the Iranians' hands right now. We're talking some really pretty sophisticated technology and military equipment. So that to me was the biggest mistake the Biden administration did.
Isn't that somewhat of a mistake that the Soviet Union raid or excuse me, isn't that the mistake that the Soviet Union made when they were fighting the Taliban? They left a lot of these AK-47, a lot of
But they
their
had no
military
choice.
stuff
They
on the
got their
ground.
butts kicked. They just the Soviets were the Russians were sick and tired of having people come home in body bags.
Yeah,
We had a choice here. There was a negotiation with the Taliban. Trump wanted to actually meet with them. You know, there were discussions directly with the Taliban taking place in Qatar, in Doha, you know, about that. So you could have phased it differently and actually made sure that the most of the equipment and key people and key Afghans who've worked with us all these years loyally had a chance to get out. So that's my one critique. But whether it was, but do I generally agree it's a band-aid that had to be removed? Yeah, I do believe that. Now, you know, I said this last time we spoke. I'm tired of talking about Afghanistan without asking what were we doing in Afghanistan? What were those
agreed.
20 years about, right? Did Afghanistan attack us? No. Was Osama bin Laden killed in Afghanistan? No, he was killed in Pakistan. Did they shelter him? Yeah, they sheltered him. Many countries sheltered him. So what we're going to do, a 20-year war, trillions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of people dead, maimed, never will recover, people who are going to suffer traumas for the rest of their lives, physical and emotional trauma. People are coming back from there. What were we actually doing there? Did we change anything? You got the Taliban right back. Now, Afghanistan today is not Afghanistan of 20 years ago. People have smartphones. Women have smartphones. Women, I don't think it's going to be quite as easy for the Taliban today as it was in the past to repress an entire population. But Afghanistan, any fool would have said, and it's not just looking at the Soviets, any fool would have said, first of all, you really have to have your head examined if you think you're gonna spend a lot of time in Afghanistan. This is a country that's fought everyone who thought they should spend some time there for centuries and centuries, number one. Number two, the idea that we're helping to build an Afghan military is so ridiculous as to be laughable. The one thing the Afghans don't need to be taught is how to fight. Every 5-year-old knows how to use an AK-47, right? Same in Yemen. You don't need to teach Yemenis how to fight. You need to teach them how to run a country properly. And the third thing is, what was the model in Afghanistan? If we're going to be there and we say, no, we're trying to help them build a state, right? Well, what's the model? Why are we not saying, hey, but Afghanistan is a complicated country, 42% one ethnic the Pashtuns, then you have 17% Tajiks, then you have tons of little minority ethnic groups, right? How do we do that? How do we decentralize it? How do we work with them? How do we bring them into the fold? We had 20 years to do that. So I don't think we should have been there, but if we're going to be there, we can't do better than this. That's insane. And so, yeah, if you're going to fly a few smart McKinsey guys over there who keep talking about the great American democracy model, this is what you're going to get. And you've got to work with people on the ground and start to build that there, right? Start to develop teachers there with what they have on the ground. That's the right way to do development. And this is a hard thing. We've got to look into the mirror, whether it's the U.S. Agency for International Development, AID, other groups, and say, you really suck at foreign development, right? You really don't understand it because your objectives are not given from a development perspective, but they're given by the State Department. And if you're going to ask the army, if you're going to ask the military if we should pour in more money, that's like Warren Buffett says, you don't ask your barber if you need a haircut, right? If you're going to ask the military if they need more troops there, the answer will always be yes. Every general will say yes. So there's a lot wrong in the way. And now what happens? Every American politician wants to sound tough. They're not going to say no to the military. So you get into just like the Iraq war, right? That's what killed Hillary Clinton's campaign. Same with Joe Biden. They were all for the Iraq war. Why? Because they didn't want to sound like wimps. They knew it was wrong. They knew there were no weapons of mass destruction. There were none. They knew all that. That was the wrong decision. Some courageous senators had the guts to say no. We are not convinced Saddam doesn't have weapon of mass destruction. Some courageous senators said, what is this in Afghanistan? What are we doing? We got to rethink this. We can't keep pouring good money after bad money, good people after dead people. We can't keep doing that. But in our political discourse here, you're deemed a wimp. You're deemed soft if you don't support these rah-rah foreign invaders. The same people say America first, let's stop that, are the same guys the same people who want to sound like tough guys when it comes to these situations. So the intelligent debate doesn't really happen. And I mean that seriously. We have to start thinking not just about what our foreign policy should be, but whether we still have the ability to make intelligent foreign policies. Because if you just care about your election in Oklahoma next year, or in Florida or New York or in California, wherever it is, and you can go there and say, hey man, I'm supporting our troops, and you wear some little logo on your shirt or a bumper sticker on your car, right? That's silly. That's silly. You want to support our troops in Afghanistan? Don't go there. That's what supports our troops. Bring them home. That supports our troops. That's the gutsy thing. And every country goes through that. Israel went through that in the Lebanon War, 1982. That was the wrong war. That was a private war that Ariel Sharon did. He misled his own prime minister, Menachem Begin, who never recovered from that. It took guts for Ehud Barak later, years later, to say, we're done. We're getting out of there, right? You know what the Lebanon War created? Hezbollah. It didn't exist before the Lebanon War.
I want to ask you this question. And my thing was, after 9/11, you go in, you bomb the Taliban, you get right out. There's no ground forces, none of that stuff. I believe personally, and I want to get your opinion on this because I've, studied a lot of this, watched a lot of this, but you never know who you're listening to because it's the media and everybody has their different perspective that they swindle you with. But my thing was that they wanted to go into, America after 9/11 wanted a war with somebody. Bush knew that. They bombed Afghanistan. Then that was kind of the setup to go into Iraq. And then, we go in through the lies by the administration, the lies that people were telling them as far as the CIA and stuff like that. So, I mean, you can jump in with that, but that's what I feel like that Afghanistan was a setup to go into Iraq. And I don't know if you saw this comment, but Wesley Clark, who was in the Clinton administration, he said it. He said that he was getting calls from people that were in the Defense Department saying that they were going to Iraq, right, even before they even bombed Afghanistan, saying that they were looking at like 7 countries they wanted to hit within the administration's time. I mean, this is scary stuff. And this is before a lot of this stuff even happened. Before 9/11 and stuff. It's crazy.
Yeah, so once 9/11 happened, it was a real trauma to our people. And we don't look at these things rationally, right? So terrible day, 3,000 people die, awful day. There are days of 3,000 people have died from COVID, and yet we can't get a vaccine mandate and a mask mandate, right? Daily. We have 9/11s happening daily. Yeah. And people some are okay with that, but God forbid you don't stand at the right 9/11 ceremony. Now, it was a tragedy, it was national trauma, and our country changed. Our surveillance changed. The fact that anyone can listen into your cell phones and look at your records, that all changed. It wasn't like that before 9/11. But what happened in 9/11, it was also a certain criminalization of government. And please, for anyone listening to this is not about whether I like Bush or don't like Bush. This is not a political statement. Here's a fact. When Dick Cheney's staff, mainly Scooter Libby and Cheney and a few others, Wolfowitz, all those guys, when they were looking for a smoking gun with Saddam, they started the claim that in a country in Africa called Niger, not Nigeria, but Niger, that they had sold uranium to Saddam. And the prime minister of Niger, former prime minister called Ibrahim Mayaki, who's a good friend of mine, told me, he told everyone. He told Ambassador Wilson, he called the White House. He tried to talk to Dick Cheney's staff and said, what are you talking about? Our uranium is sold only to 2 countries, to Japan and France, for their civil nuclear programs, and we owe it to them for the next 100 years. I couldn't have sold it to Saddam if I wanted to. Stop spreading that rumor. He was told by the vice president's staff, shut up. We don't want to hear that. And the staff then told Colin Powell, you go to the United Nations and make those fateful, what we call the 16-word statement, right, about Saddam owning that. Now, you got to look at that and look at how that changed the world, whether it's Iraq or Afghanistan. Look how it changed the world. ISIS didn't exist, right? So because there's mistakes within the mistakes. Not only is the whole thing based on a lie, not only does the whole thing not make sense because you're trying to go after a state for something that a non-state actor did to us. Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, if he was supported by anyone, it was by Saudi Arabia. He came out of the Saudi establishment. And by the way, Osama bin Laden's early years, he was the son of one of the largest Saudi real estate developers, most successful, the guy who built all the mosques, built all the palaces for the kings, the bin Laden group. It still exists today. He was a religious man. His mother's Syrian, his father's Saudi, and Osama bin Laden. He went after the Saudi royals first. They kicked him out of the country. He went after them and said, "You're a bunch of corrupt princes. You're destroying our own country. You guys, you're hypocrites. You say you're religious, but you go and womanize and drink booze behind our backs." And they kicked him out of their own country. And they were happy with him to go after the West and the US so that he wouldn't go after them. So there's a story within the story. At the same time, the Saudi ambassador called Prince Bandar, they called him Bush Bandar. He had a house in Virginia, was that friendly with the Bush and the Cheneys. He's the one who got Halliburton all their contracts in the region, and Bechtel all the contracts. And that's not just Dick Cheney and Halliburton, that's George Shultz on the board of Bechtel. It gets very messy very quickly. Bless you. And so it gets messy quickly. And so when you ask about these wars, it's not just about misdiagnosing whether they're smart or not smart. There are interests in there. And what is so hard is all the people, Americans and non-Americans, who pay the price for these greedy mistakes that happen, right? And that's where I feel one of the things I feel very strongly about, to finish my answer here, I think one of the things in this country that we actually need is a draft. I think everyone should serve. I'm not saying everyone has to serve in military. I'm not saying everyone has to serve in combat, but everyone should serve. Someone graduates high school, they should spend 2 or 3 years, everybody, my kids, everybody, serving. Again, you don't have to be in SEAL Team 6, and it doesn't have to be combat. You can do civil service. You can work in an old age home. You can distribute food to the homeless. It doesn't matter. But everyone should serve so that there's a sense that we're in this together. The one thing that was amazing, both with Afghanistan and Iraq, it was really amazing, is the decision makers in the White House, in the vice president's office, all their advisors were all people who had dodged the draft in Vietnam. One of the most amazing things. And I think if you serve, I've served in the Army, I've been in combat, and I see what price that takes. I think if you really experience it yourself, and if your children are in harm's way, you start to think a little bit differently. This is not just a video game where you're moving people around and you're not paying a price yourself. It's 3,000 miles away, right? So that's one of the angles. Just to close it more on a more, I would say, sort of future-oriented note. I really think it's something we should consider carefully. It would be good for this country where everyone after high school, at that age, around 18, serves in some capacity. Again, it doesn't have to be military, but somewhere or other to contribute to your country. It's not just me, 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 me.
I want to get your opinion. Whether we put this on, it's totally up to you. But my thing is that back in August, Bush was getting these letters saying that they were going to attack America. They didn't take it seriously. I've watched these TV shows, like I said, these documentaries on it saying the Clinton administration was telling the Bush administration when they came in, you have to worry about bin Laden. There's something that's going to happen. Obviously, 93, when Clinton was in office, the World Trade Center, the coal, the embassies in Nairobi, Kenya. I mean, we this stuff was reoccurring. It was going to happen for sure. And then you get that letter in August, right before September, that's saying that bin Laden is going to attack America, and no one does nothing. Do you feel that this was the fault of the Bush administration, that they just really, in basic terms, they didn't give a shit and they just kind of let stuff happen? Maybe that's not the politically correct thing to say.
I mean,
but...
I'm not. For me, it's not about going the Bush administration. I think that yes, the answer is, and you can put this on. I don't mind. I do believe they were criminally negligent in taking these warnings seriously. I don't think it was a conspiracy. You hear all kinds of conspiracies.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to say
the building shouldn't have collapsed and someone undermined it. I think that's silly. I do believe they were criminally negligent, but I think also, and on a really serious note, right now our discourse in the country is all about how people hate government, right? You can't even get a vaccine mandate. You can't ask people to wear masks for their own protection and protection of loved ones. It becomes silly. Like, what's next? Don't stop at a red light because the government tells you to stop at a red light, right? And so I started way before Bush. This is Reagan who started this whole idea that for him, government's never a solution, it's always the problem. This idea that you vilify government, which never used to be about, the Republicans never thought that. Theodore Roosevelt started plenty of federal programs, including national parks. But I mean, the idea that now you can debate tax policy, you can debate size of government, efficiency of government. Look, I'm a progressive person, and yet I think government's crazy, inefficient, and wasteful. I really
Agreed.
do believe that. And I think there's room for that. Well, our healthcare per capita is more expensive than any country in the world. It's more
Yeah.
expensive, way more expensive than Switzerland, and they have the most unbelievable healthcare. So it's not that we're not spending it on it, it's just we don't do it well. And so I think there's a lot about government that really doesn't work. I think there's a lot about our political system that doesn't work. But what happened with Reagan was this sort of attack on government. It was always coded about state rights and federal government trying to tell states what to do. And it was always coded that way, but it never was about that. It started to become, it then led later, it was the Gingrich Revolution, then led to the Tea Party later, of course, right? Where it's sort of, you're burning down the house because you just don't, you hate the house so much. And so for me, Bush was in that trajectory where you had amazing intelligence operatives. I know some of them who briefed Cheney and said, look, this is coming our way. It's not just about 9/11 and the plans and the flight schools and things like that were in but shared, but generally the kind of hatreds that's taking place, the plans that are being hatched, really good men and women who did that. And because of this general thing that you belittle government, you belittle education, you belittle intelligence, both government intelligence and intelligence generally, right? Where now you have to kind of dumb it down if you campaign for office. You're not allowed to be smart. People say about Obama, oh, he's such an elitist. I mean, don't I want my president to be smart? You may not like someone who's arrogant if you think they're arrogant, but I still want the person who controls so much of the fate of the world in our country to be smart. Of course I want that. I'm not going to campaign on being dumb. That no longer works right now, right? It's all this thing, well, the left looks down on the right, and it's become that. And so when you look at government always as the enemy, you don't function as a society anymore, right? You can't have military policy, you can't have healthcare, you can't have education policy, you just can't do it. Now, you should have good education policy, efficient one. It shouldn't be wasteful. I'm all for that. But the idea that you declare government the enemy means that you can't deal with a pandemic properly. You can't deal with an attack on 9/11 properly. And that was, so for me, when you asked me that question, yeah, I think it was criminally negligent, but it's part of that whole, the tough kind of the cool guy who's into sports doesn't want to really read the intelligence briefings. Now, I like sports too, but if I'm president of the United States, yeah, I do have to get up in the morning and read where are my threats against my country coming from. That's what I expect from the president.
Right.
I'd expect him to watch a baseball game at that time or to watch Fox News and Fox and Friends. I want the person to do that. I don't care if someone likes to watch Fox and Friends. God bless you, but don't be president of the United States. That's my point. So to me, the Bush thing started there, and then you saw it with McCain choosing Palin. Why did he choose her? Because it would appeal to that crowd. By then, the Tea Party was really powerful. Oh, it really was. And then you got Trump. So it's all this trajectory that, that kind of, you can't really be serious as a thinker and run. So that's the mistake I think they made.
But what I'm worried about is the next Trump, regardless if it's Donald J. Trump or it's somebody that's more competent than him, that's more intelligent than him. Are you worried about that the U.S. is going down this path where we could have a 1933 saga and, where a person like a Hitler-like character comes to power? What's your take on that?
I always worry about that. I think that I don't like name calling. I don't like it in politics or anywhere else. So to just say he's a fascist or, people throw out the word Nazi really easily. I think there's, until someone's exterminated millions of people, you don't just throw out the word Nazi at a person. So I don't like inflammatory name calling anyhow. And I don't like it in Trump. I think Trump's a little more complicated than that. I think his views before he ran for office were actually surprisingly progressive on many things, whether it's the women's rights to choose or other things. It was actually, funny enough, really pretty reasonable things. He was always sort of his personality, kind of a celebrity, and they did that. But I think he was really underestimated. What he realized, he is a narcissist. So what he realized when he ran is that he would get the loudest cheers from the farthest right. And a narcissist goes for the cheers. And so the more outrageous sort of fascist, if you want to put it that way, statements he made, whether they were racial or otherwise, the louder the cheers got. And so he kept doing it more and more. So it was that reinforcement. I think he then realized that's his base. So the Charlottesville crowd became his base, right? Because they cheered the loudest and they became about a third of the Republican Party. the hardcore far-right base is about a third of Republican voters. Now, no Republican can win without that because of our electoral system, because of gerrymandering, because you got safe elections now. So that's a whole different issue. Where I think Trump really, it's fair to call him a fascist, and not just Trump, but others, is this notion that you don't recognize elections. That was new in this country, where if you lose an election, it couldn't have been a fair election. He said that already when he was running against Hillary, that if he loses, it was because it's rigged. He didn't expect to win. Right there, I do think it was a money-making thing. He had a lot of debt, and that was his way out of it. His celebrity stuff was dead already; no one cared anymore, and he had to repay debt, and that was a way to increase his brand name. And so he planted that seed, and that's to me a fascist seed, where you come to power by democratic means, but then you refuse to leave power by democratic means. Right? That's fascism. And in that respect, I think it's fair to call Trump a fascist. So it's not only okay he incited the mob on January 6th. You can look at that and you can call him whatever you want to call him for that. But to me, the general notion that you don't leave when you lost an election, he clearly lost an election. He lost the popular vote by a lot, and he clearly lost the election. There were recounts that actually gave more votes to Biden now when they just did it again in Arizona. So to me, not playing by that rule, that's the definition of fascism in this respect. And so that's the one way I think it's fair to call him that, and where I do think people who are worried about the future of our country should be worried about that. Where you saw it in the recall, we even have it baked into our systems where you don't like the governor of California, just do a recall. Well, hey, I didn't win the election, so let's just keep doing it until I'm in power, right? And then that gets very, very dangerous. And that's a country I don't think any of us really want to live in. That's not the country we want for our children. That the country where someone can come to power. That's when we start to look. We talked earlier about Xi Jinping. We talked about Putin in Russia, right? We talk about there are countries where someone gets to power by democratic means, more or less democratic means. Certainly in Russia it was democratic means. And then they don't leave. And they may play with the constitution to make it look like they're still there legitimately, but they don't leave. There's no free election in China. There's no free election in Russia. And when you get to that place, if we got to that place in the United States, we would be a very, very different country. And that's the stuff that worries me about Trump, is it's not like the crazy statements about women or whatever. He's made a lot of crazy statements. Listen, it's entertainment, and our politics, unfortunately, has become entertainment, just like news has become entertainment. And so that's what you get. If you reward with high advertisement the craziest, most outrageous, hideous statements, then I guess that's what you're going to get. The question is, on the Democratic side, if people don't leave when they lost an election, you've got a whole different problem.
But it's the same, not just in the U.S., but we look at Brazil, Poland,
Hungary,
yeah, Italy. This is going around the world now that these type of leaders are rising to power. We look at North Korea too with Kim. So it's all over the place. So this is a scary world. And, some group gets weapons or does something crazy. First we were worried about like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now it's leaders of that legitimately won, and they just want to stay in power, or they have these fascist tendencies.
Right. And to me, the fact that the Republican Party voted against impeaching him, that they all know it. I talked to plenty of these guys, senators and members of the House directly. Certainly in the Senate, the House is a lot of crazy stuff, but certainly in the Senate, they all tell you, the dude's a fascist, he's dangerous for our country, but if I vote against it, we're done.
Yep.
You're going to get some crazy. You think Mitch McConnell doesn't know that Trump incited violence and in fact deserved to be impeached? Under any standard, deserve to be impeached. You impeach Bill Clinton for a blowjob, and you don't impeach Donald Trump for citing an insurrection and not accepting an election outcome. That doesn't make any sense. I'm serious. Just forget your politics for a moment. Just look at it. I know they say it was Clinton. It wasn't about that. It was about lying under oath, but it really was about a blowjob, right? And then you look at Trump. You look at January 6th and say that's what you want for your country.
People died.
Now it may be you in power. The next day they come for you, and there's a beautiful sentence of a German pastor called Niemöller in the Second World War, a Protestant pastor. He said, first they came for the socialists, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the communists, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up.
Yeah, it's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what
But
we have to remember. And to all those who think I'm just don't like Donald Trump, just remember this. Right now it's you, but you may have power now through a guy like that, but the tables could be switched. How would it feel if Biden or Obama or anyone else that you don't like refuses to leave after you lose the election, keeps saying it's rigged, and incites a mob to go into the Capitol? How would you feel about that? All of you who think that I'm not an apologist for one side or another. It only works, and we can only live as a society if we can figure out when the tables are switched and we have some semblance of fairness. But if we just hate the other and anyone who's not like us is someone who deserves hate or we wish death to, right? And listen, I've had this conversation with liberal friends when they say, God, I hope all those Trump-loving anti-vaxxers die. It's like, don't say that. Don't say that. Don't think that. When you start to think that way, we're doomed. We're doomed as a country. We're no longer united.
Well, I think the issue is, and I'll end with this, is that a lot of people that are the liberal friends, like you said, I consider myself pretty progressive, but I don't act like some of these people, like you said, that want just these people that are Republicans that are anti-vaxxers to die. I got my vaccine. I'm comfortable wearing a mask, going in and out of stores. It's just the way it is until it's over. Regardless of that, we hear this on the news that, there's doctors going on MSNBC. I watched it the other day saying, if somebody comes in that's anti-vaxxer, we shouldn't offer them health care. I mean, this is starting to get a little out of control. I mean, just because we don't agree with them, and people don't understand. I have a lot of friends that voted for Trump, older, younger friends, and we can have a good conversation. We don't yell and scream and swear at each other. We have a conversation. And I know why some of them voted for Trump, not because they liked him, because like you said, Daniel, a lot of things that he was for when he ran in the campaign, he said he wanted health care for everybody. People forget these things. He wanted to bring back the jobs. Now, we knew he was full of probably crap, but you know what? He said these things and he was talking the language. Again, he knows how to, as a celebrity, work the crowd and get them riled up. And he knows those words. We can even say that back in 2016, he was using a lot of Bernie Sanders' platform when he was running against Hillary Clinton. So you have to talk to these people and really, there are like you said, the racist, the anti-Semitic people that voted for Trump. But there's a lot of people that aren't like that just are misinformed
A lot of Jewish
or
people voted for
unintelligent.
Trump. And you have Jewish voters who voted for
Yeah.
Trump. So that's,
Oh, yeah.
I think that, on the insurance side, that's the only thing I'll beg to differ. It's not that you should say they shouldn't get healthcare. What I'm saying is I think we have to have incentive systems built into our system. And so insurance, for example, you mentioned overweight people. I think this is not about going against overweight people. I just think that just like driving, your insurance policy goes down if you're a careful driver. I think the same thing is how you conduct yourself for your life. So look, someone has a pre-existing condition, you don't penalize them, right? But if someone lives recklessly and as a result has massive healthcare costs, there's a way to build an incentive so that they have an incentive not to do that with premium discounts, right? And I feel the same way. So if you're offered a vaccine and you don't have a reason not to take it, no, you're worried about blood clots or something, but like whatever, right? You have no reason, you're offered a vaccine, you don't do it. For example, I think that you're not prioritized with ICU beds if someone who did get it, right? Now, we're not in that situation because, in fact, very few people are hospitalized in ICUs or die who actually were vaccinated.
Right.
But to me, it's okay to build in those types of incentives. Like, hey, you don't want to get vaccinated, you get the right to do that, but you waive your right to an ICU bed in case you catch COVID then, right? So it is okay to think that through, but you have to have a discussion that is somewhat inclusive. And I know people on the left say, well, you can't talk to Trump supporters that scream racial. That's not true. Right. It's not. Yeah, there's some people you can't talk to anywhere. I get that. But if we just keep on heaping hate on the other side, we're done. As a country, we're just done. We're heading just on a real fast trajectory downwards then.
We'll end there. There was so many other things, but we'll end up talking for 2 hours. I don't want to keep you up for too long. Daniel Levin here on Fire Breathing Rob. I appreciate his time. Definitely check out Proof of Life in Amazon stores or in bookstores in general all around the country. Can people follow you anywhere? I know you have a website,
I
Daniel.
have a website, daniellevinauthor.com. I don't do social media, so but whatever events, interviews, I usually put them on the website, or my publicist puts them there, so they, you can catch it all there.
All right, Daniel Levin, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.